This episode is brought to you in part by Museum of the Bible and its new worship experience, All Creation Sings, made in partnership with Creator. Step into an immersive room with vibrant visuals, soundscapes of praise, and interactive displays illuminating the story of worship. Get tickets at museumofthebible.org/ACS.
The following is a paid advertisement. Hey everybody, here on Truce we're in the middle of a series about how some evangelicals tied themselves to the Republican Party. There are lots of reasons for that, but some of it has to do with racism and the proliferation of conspiracy theories. You know, heavy subjects. So in this bonus episode, let's provide some hope. Today I'm pleased to present an episode from the Compelled podcast that fits nicely within this season. Compelled is hosted by my friend Paul Hastings, and his voice may sound familiar because I interviewed him at the beginning of the R.J. Rushdoony episode. Compelled is a highly produced, immersive show that shares people's testimonies, and they just released an episode about a man who was caught up in the KKK. His fear that communism was coming for his vision of Christian America drove him to do terrible things. But God got his attention and saved him. In this era where it seems like we all know someone who's caught up in extremism, this is a great reminder that Jesus still sets captives free. I think you're really going to like it. So it's my honor to turn it over to Paul.
Hey there, I'm Paul Hastings, and thanks to my buddy Chris at Truce, you're listening to a special preview episode of my podcast, Compelled, where I use gripping, immersive storytelling to bring to life Christian testimonies from the kingdom of God, told by the people compelled to live for Him. In each of our episodes, we highlight the power of Christ to transform any life, like a boy who survived the Rwandan genocide, but years later came face to face with the militant who killed his family and was convicted that Jesus asked him to forgive. Or a firefighter who fell through the roof of a burning building and instantly realized he was going to die unless God intervened. Every story on Compelled is unique, riveting, and true. And today, our guest is Tom Tarrants. In the 1960s, Tom was a young man on a mission to save America from communism, Marxism, and desegregation. He was prepared to do anything, including joining the Ku Klux Klan, drive-by shootings, or even dying for his cause. Yet God had a far greater plan for this would-be revolutionary. So gather round, lean in, and join us for this compelling story from the kingdom of God. This past summer, I met up with Tom at a mutual friend's office in the heart of Washington, D.C. Tom was born in the American South in 1946, immediately after World War II, and his upbringing in the heart of Dixie was fairly typical of the era.
I grew up in Mobile, Alabama, very traditional southern city. Mom and Dad were just ordinary people. Mom stayed at home, Dad worked in automobile business, and had a brother and a sister, and we sort of went through the typical things that you would expect at that point in life. We went to church. My mother insisted on us going to church every Sunday, so we were regular and went to a good church, a Southern Baptist church, where they preached the gospel. My mother read me Bible stories and that kind of thing, but I have to be honest and say that I understood what was said, cognitively comprehended what was said, but it really didn't move me in any kind of significant way that I can recall. I thought it was true like I suppose most kids do. They believe what their parents tell them. I never had any issues of doubt, but it just never really took hold of me. When I was about 13 years old, I had heard enough preaching in Sunday school to know that there was a place called hell and that I did not want to go there. And I made a profession of faith, but it was really out of fear. And I was promptly baptized, as you would expect in a Baptist church. But I went down lost and came back up lost. However, after making the profession of faith, there was one change. And that change was that I thought, I can breathe a sigh of relief now. I don't have to worry about going to hell. I've basically punched my ticket, so to speak. But it had no effect on my life, how I lived. I grew up in, as I said, in Mobile, Alabama. Mobile was founded in 1702. And from 1702 until 1963, I suppose, it was segregated. People knew nothing but segregation. Now, this is very difficult for people today to imagine, but Black people lived in their part of town. They had their grocery stores and movie theaters and all the rest. White people lived in their section of town, which was much larger and much nicer, and there was no mixing at all, period. Black people couldn't live in white neighborhoods. Nobody even thought of such a thing. Schools were totally segregated. In terms of public accommodations, for example, you go into some public building, you would have water fountains, restrooms, each would have a sign over it, white and colored. The whole society was oriented that way, and it was just assumed to be normal. I never knew of a Black person who had a college degree. Black people weren't involved in the city government. White people were in charge. Everybody pretty much thought that way. It wasn't something special to be making a point about. White people were superior, Black people were inferior. That was the general prevailing attitude in the society. I had no Black friends, but we did have a maid who worked for us, and we loved her. She was like a member of the family. My dad had some Black guys that worked for him. One of them particularly would work on our cars occasionally, a guy named Joe. We loved Joe, but it was very much that kind of a thing, and people in subservient positions, no Black people in any kind of leadership positions.
To Tom, his childhood days felt pretty normal. But as Tom became a teenager, things began changing. America no longer felt like the dominant superpower it had been right out of World War II. Instead, Soviet spies had stolen information from America's nuclear program and built a hydrogen bomb. Shortly after, the Russians launched Sputnik in 1957, the first man-made object to enter space. And at the same time, communist revolutions in Vietnam and Cuba were gaining momentum, and additional revolts in Central America and Southeast Asia were right around the corner. Communism was on the rise, and there didn't seem to be any stopping it. Simultaneously, there was growing unrest in America. The U.S. Supreme Court issued the Brown versus Board of Education decision, ruling that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. Rosa Parks launched her famous bus boycott in Tom's home state of Alabama, and President Eisenhower signed the Civil Rights Act of 1957 and 1960. Then, in 1963, Alabama Governor George Wallace waltzed into the history books, declaring in his inaugural address that he supported segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And months later, infamously tried to physically block 2 African-American students from attending the University of Alabama. In response, President John F. Kennedy issued an executive order federalizing the Alabama National Guard. Many Southerners, including Tom and most of his friends, felt that their status quo and way of life was being threatened and encroached upon by the federal government. And then back on the global front, Cuba was now firmly in the hands of Fidel Castro, and the CIA had to admit to their failed Bay of Pigs fiasco. The next year, the Soviets began building the Berlin Wall, and the Cuban Missile Crisis convinced many that World War III was about to erupt at any moment, this time with a nuclear holocaust on American soil. And it was against this backdrop of social unrest, racism, civil rights activism, fear of the Soviet Union, and general paranoia about communism and desegregation that Tom began his junior year of high school in September 1963.
And so when I went to school, that first day of school, I found the campus and it was surrounded by troops. They were National Guard troops that had been federalized, so they were under government control. They were there to ensure the peaceful admission of a couple of black girls. there was a lot of unrest among students. No violence, but a lot of unrest. I did not interact with them. I think I've called them some ugly names when passing in the hallways. I was aggravated and angry about it. It was contradicting everything I'd ever known, grown up with. And so this was a kind of a direct assault, a head-on assault against the things that I thought were right and good. Somebody was distributing literature that opposed all of this, produced by the National States Rights Party. And so I got some of that and read it, and that opened the door to more engagement with their materials. And then I met some folks that were part of that. And so I read a book by J. Edgar Hoover about communist threats to America. And that just solidified my earlier beliefs. If the director of the FBI says this is a problem, I don't have any doubts or questions. I just take it as fact. So that amped up my concern, about communism and communist threats. And the racist literature, the National States Rights Party stuff, of course, was talking about various racial issues, that black people were inferior to white people, that race mixing would pollute the superior race and bring about the decline of the culture, that kind of narrative. So I fell into that, began to read that kind of material, and I was now connected with people who believed all of that and were reinforcing and saying, yeah, you're right, you got it. This is what we're dealing with. There was a minority, I think, in Alabama that would not have been part of that thinking, but they had to keep their heads down. I was not part of that minority. I was part of the majority, and I was swept up into the emotion of all of this. I became isolated from all of the previous influences and just wrapped up in relationships with people who thought the way I thought. This whole ideology that I've described has behind it the idea that the Jews are secretly manipulating all of these events, that they are actually behind communism, and that they are working a plan to eventually dominate and control the world. They are the greatest enemies, the Jews. And of course, they would cite things like, well, Karl Marx was a Jew. Leaders of the Bolshevik Revolution were Jews, and on and on. Well, that really got my attention. And so I was particularly hateful towards some Jews there in my high school, punching them, pushing them, and that sort of thing. And several episodes of that with a couple of the guys. When you take on board this kind of stuff, this kind of ideology, this cancer of the soul, really, it generates within you fear and anger at what's causing the fear.
And at this point, you're like 17. Are you still going to church?
No. After I got baptized, church attendance became very irregular, shall we say, and trailed off into basically nothing. I didn't read the Bible, and I didn't pray because my heart wasn't there. My heart had been seduced by ideology. Ideology can be an idol. At some point, my mentality shifted, and I came to think, as they would say today, desperate times require desperate measures. In other words, I was being gradually indoctrinated quite willingly. Well, nobody was forcing anything on me, but I was quite willingly absorbing, assimilating these views. And, that kind of stuff has an arc. It has a trajectory. It's going somewhere. You don't necessarily know it at the moment, but it's changing you. It's changing the way you think, the way you look at the world, and what you think your response needs to be to the things you're learning. And so that was it. Desperate times require desperate measures. People need to wake up to all this conspiracy around us. And here's the government cramming this down our throats and trying to wreck white Christian civilization. That was a phrase that was often used. This desegregation, this communist conspiracy, is part of trying to undermine and overthrow white Christian civilization. I began to make threatening phone calls to black leaders and to Jewish leaders, rabbis. And then it escalated to painting swastika on one of the synagogues in town. At one point, I fired some shots into the home of the mayor in his big glass window on the front of his house, because he was more sympathetic to desegregation.
President Kennedy was assassinated at the end of that year, and Tom was convinced that the Jews and communists were about to launch a takeover of America. Tom had immersed himself within a radicalized faction of white supremacists and was living in his own echo chamber. He dropped out of high school and began preparing for the imminent civil war that he believed would erupt at any moment. Although he was surreptitiously engaging in midnight drive-by shootings, those were mainly to terrorize and intimidate the residents of the targeted homes, normally a prominent civil rights figure or politician. As far as Tom knew, he hadn't actually hit anyone, but neither did he stick around to find out. The United States needed to wake up to the communist threat among them. Bold action was needed to inspire others, and the ends justified the means, even if it meant violence. And as Tom's enthusiasm for the cause increased, so did his firepower. Tom began acquiring and practicing with a wide variety of weapons, both legal and illegal. A couple years later, Tom was pulled over during a routine police stop, and they found a submachine gun in his front seat, a federal crime. Incredibly, Tom was let go on bail, and by the time a federal indictment was released, Tom was long gone and living off the grid with members of a radical terrorist organization known as the Ku Klux Klan.
The Klan had been responsible for a number of murders of black civil rights figures. A very famous case, 3 civil rights workers in Philadelphia, Mississippi were abducted and murdered and buried under a dam and later discovered. That put the whole country on the edge. It was a nationwide development in terms of the attention that it created. It was just a huge thing. Also, a group of them, a fairly large group, attacked the home of the NAACP director in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, a guy named Vernon Damer. They fired into his home late at night, set it on fire with he and his family in it. And the family was able to somehow get out. He helped them get out, but he was killed in the process. Another one of their people assassinated another NAACP director up in Greenville, Mississippi, maybe it was. That was a huge thing all over the country, too. So Mississippi was seen to be this kind of area where there was guerrilla warfare, basically, going on with a small group of these white racist people fighting against people trying to register voters and, that sort of thing.
2 weeks after Tom had gone into hiding, Martin Luther King Jr. was murdered. Tom didn't know who had done it, but he felt emboldened. America was finally waking up, and Tom and the KKK were on the front row. They were the true patriots, willing to do anything to save America. And Tom had just the plan for what to do next.
A young lady from Jackson, Mississippi, who was a member of the Klan, Kathy Ainsworth, was a school teacher, elementary school teacher. You'd never imagine she would be involved in anything like this. But she and I went to bomb the home of this Jewish businessman in Meridian, Mississippi. He had come under our attention for his attacks against the Klan in the newspaper and Klan activities. And so we were going to teach him a lesson, so to speak. There were other people in this organization that I connected with, and I was able to get dynamite and the things that were required for a bomb from them. So we took that over there, fully expecting that it would be no problem at all to do it. About 1 o'clock in the morning, as I recall, we circled around the neighborhood to see if there were any people out walking or whatnot. Everything was very quiet, nothing suspicious. So pulled up in front of the house and got out of the car with this bomb. Kathy stayed in the car while I walked up this concrete driveway to the carport of the house, and I was going to put the bomb there. set the timer, and then get back in the car and drive away. About halfway up the driveway, shots rang out. I was just totally stunned. I didn't know what was going on. But quickly I realized I was in trouble. Turns out that the FBI had learned about this plan, and they had alerted the local police. And there was a SWAT team, 26 men dressed in black, heavily armed, concealed behind trees and bushes and whatnot, and all around there. And the orders had been from the chief of police, no survivors. And so shots rang out, and I dropped the bomb on this concrete driveway. It should have exploded, but it didn't. And I spun around, ran back to the car. Just as I got to the front of the car, I was hit with a load of double-aught buckshot in the upper right leg. And I was able to stumble a few more feet to the door and get in the car. The bullets were flying everywhere. Everybody was converging their fire on the car. So I got in the car, started up, and sped away. And a police car had suddenly materialized and was on my bumper firing shots as they were chasing me through this this suburb. At that point, Kathy was hit. She said, I've been hit. And she slumped over and died on the seat there, I think within, just maybe a minute or something. Nothing I could do. They chased me about 15 blocks, I think, in that area around corners and whatnot. And finally, I came to a skidding halt around the corner, and they piled into the rear of my car. I got out with a submachine gun that I had and opened fire on the police car. The driver ducked. The guy that had been doing all the shooting in the passenger side was about halfway out of the car when I started shooting, and he was hit 3 times in the chest, once in the heart. My clip emptied, I dropped the gun, and the other guy popped up and fired on me, and I was hit again in the left leg. I don't know what he did after that, but I guess he went to look after his partner. But I stumbled away and collapsed behind a house right there at the intersection. I was gushing blood from the injury. And maybe 5 minutes elapsed. Police cars, FBI, state troopers, they were all converged with their big lights looking around to see where I was. And this group of 4 police officers saw me there. I was just sprawled out, didn't have a gun or anything, and just think I was in shock physically and drifting toward just utter blackness, but still enough conscious to know what was going on. And they walked up very carefully, turned off their lights, and opened fire with their shotguns. So they turned on the lights again after they'd fired, and I was still breathing. I'd been hit twice, but not in any vital areas. And one of the guys pulled out his pistol to finish me off. And at precisely that moment, ambulance driver who had arrived on the scene had heard the shooting, ran up to see if he could help. And so they couldn't finish me off. I was loaded on a stretcher, taken to the hospital.
Unbelievably, Tom was still alive. He had suffered massive blood loss with injuries to both legs and his stomach, and his right arm was barely still attached. But surgeons began operating on him at once, and as the weeks passed by, Tom recovered enough to be transferred to jail for trial. A couple of FBI agents began to visit him, but Tom refused to tell them anything about who he had planned the bombing with or to reveal any of his contacts. In Tom's mind, he was a hero. More on that after the break.
Do you remember when... All right, so this is Chris. I'm outside Buffalo, Wyoming. I traveled across Wyoming to report on how the ultra-wealthy use tax breaks to drive poor people out of the state.
People, I don't think, see this as a labor uprising, which it was quite literally. The cowboys were on strike against the ownership.
Or had my small group pretend to run a taco truck to demonstrate inflation? So how many tacos do you have to sell?
I have to sell 500 tacos.
Soon I'll feature an interview I did with a Stanford professor about the economics of Milton Friedman.
They presented an analysis of the Great Depression that really laid the Great Depression at the feet of the Federal Reserve.
We'll have a roundtable discussion to understand women's books of the 1970s.
This was like the Girl Wash Your Face book of 1974.
Exactly. This is not your typical Christian podcast, because I believe that audiences are intelligent, that the thing we need most in this troubled time is not simple answers, but to understand how we got here and how we can do better. And now, I'm taking a big leap of faith. I'm quitting my job driving a school bus so I can focus more of my energy on this show, because this material matters. I'm asking every listener to do 2 things. Tell your friends about the show and prayerfully consider giving $10 a month to make Truce sustainable. Nobody's getting rich here. I just need to pay my rent, health insurance, and grocery bills. $10 a month can make that dream a reality. Visit trucepodcast.com/donate to help. Paying monthly by a check is the best option because it gets around all the banking fees. But I can also take credit card, PayPal, or Venmo me at Truce Podcast. There is so much good content heading your way. Together, let's invest in Christian media that calls us back to the gospel and helps us love and understand our neighbors. trucepodcast.com/donate.
Welcome back to Compelled. Tom Tarrants was only 22, but he was all over the news. As a Ku Klux Klan terrorist, he had tried to bomb the home of a prominent Jewish businessman. And after a high-speed chase and significant gun battle, Tom was now recovering from his wounds in custody. He may have been caught, but there was absolutely no sign of remorse.
My thoughts were that I was the good guy. That's the kind of mentality that people in this extreme right wing would all think the same way. They were on God's side, fighting for God and country. That was the phrase you often heard. We called ourselves patriots. That was my mentality. Patriotic American fighting against forces that were threatening the Republic and white Christian civilization. That was how I thought of myself, and the rest of these people, too, would have shared that kind of view. I saw myself as a political prisoner. All these people would claim to be Christians, too, and some attended churches. There was no sense of being convicted of sin at all, or that what I was doing was wrong. I did, however, try to read a little bit from the Bible, and I read it, but it didn't really register with me, didn't keep my attention, so I quit reading it. I think any prayers I prayed then would have been totally self-centered, help me live through this to fight another day, that kind of thing. Just totally blind spiritually.
At last, Tom finally stood trial, which only lasted 2 days. He was found guilty of attempted bombing, a capital offense in Mississippi, which had a widely known and much used gas chamber. But in a surprising twist, and for reasons not fully known even to this day, the judge was lenient and instead sentenced Tom to 30 years in prison.
When I first went to the prison, I was put in the maximum security unit. The prison in Mississippi is not the kind of thing you see in movies, where people are in this big concrete place with big, tall concrete walls and then concrete buildings and cell blocks and all that kind of stuff. This was a prison farm, 18,000 acres, and these camps, as they call them, were sited around that 18,000-acre farm, and they would be sort of like a military barracks or something, surrounded by big, high chain-link fence with barbed wire on the top, and then there would be guard towers on the corners. But after a while, I was transferred to the hospital unit, which was also a pretty secure place. Dr. Mack, he was a great guy. He was a kind of large, jovial black guy, very friendly. Now, he's very kind to me.
Did he know your crime?
Oh, yeah. Everybody knew my crime. I was public enemy number one. I was a very well-known character. But he was very kind to me, and I would have pain in my arm, from time to time, and he would prescribe me a shot of pain-killing drug. So he was actually a guy that helped break the stereotype in my mind of black people. He was a guy that was a doctor, We were friends.
How did that compute with your white supremacist ideology?
It didn't. It just was the way it was. A thing that people should be aware of, that it's possible to break in spite of people being deeply immersed in ideology through kindness and love. It didn't change my ideology at all, but it's a kind of contradiction, you might say.
No matter what kind of conflicting thoughts Tom had about being friends with a black man, he was still driven by a single motivation, and other members of the KKK outside of prison were still eager to help.
I had one goal: escape and go back to what I was doing. I found a couple of other guys there that wanted to escape, and it took about 6 months, and I was able to make contact with some of the people I was involved with before in the Klan and organize an escape plan. The escape basically was when the night watchman was coming around handing out medications for people. He opened the door for the place where we were. And we had gotten hold of some knives, big knives out of the kitchen in prison. And flashing those knives terrified him. He cooperated and tied him up, took the keys to his car. We had arranged with one of the guards. There was only one guard on duty on one of the towers, and he was an inmate. They had a trustee system there where they promote certain inmates to the status of trustee, and some of those, they had a lot more freedom and privileges, and some of those actually were given firearms to serve as guards. That's the way it worked in those days. So we had made arrangements with this guy, offered him some money to let us get out of there. So we walked out the front gate, got in the watchman's car, drove down a farm road. The car was not able to go the full distance because a bridge was out covering a little stream that went across this terrain. So we had to ditch the car, get out and walk through the stream, and then run the rest of the distance. We had to get there quickly because once the word got out about the escape, we had to get to our rendezvous point as quickly as possible. The car was waiting for us, and the people we had coordinated this with were there waiting to pick us up.
Were they also from the Klan?
Yeah, right. 2 of them were there, well-armed, automatic weapons and hand grenades, and ready to take us to a hideout. We went probably a couple hundred miles away, maybe, or to an old abandoned farm that was in a heavily...
To hear the rest of Tom's compelling story and the incredible transformation brought about by Christ, just search for Compelled on your favorite podcast app. Tom's episode is number 87, KKK Terrorist Finds Christ. Again, that's on Compelled, or visit compelledpodcast.com.
That's it for this bonus. Look for a new episode of Truce out next week. In the meantime, why not download some episodes of Compelled? And God willing, we'll talk again soon. This episode is brought to you by the Compelled Podcast. What would you do if you came face to face with a murderer sent to kill you for being a Christian? For Virginia Prodan, that question isn't hypothetical. Virginia was a small, petite attorney defending Christians in court in communist Romania. And she was really good. So good, in fact, she caught the attention of the communist regime. One day, a tall, muscular man walked into her office, closed the door, and pulled out a gun. He barked, "Shut up, sit down. I'm here to kill you." Virginia was face to face with a trained assassin. What happened next would surprise both of them. Listen to Virginia's entire story on the Compelled podcast, where they find incredible true-life stories of God working through the lives of normal people. Virginia is on episode number 31, which is titled, He Came to Kill Me. Listen on your podcasting app or at compelledpodcast.com.